Right, so I think we're gonna start and let people get in during the session because this is how it's been working so far during the conference. People getting in and out of the sessions depending on their point of interest. Um, as a chair for this session, I just want to say a word before we start regarding the current threat of in our democracies and to say that I'm in full solidarity with every teachers in France and in the world for the very important work they do to allow the freedom of speech and enlightenment of our young generations. I think that as a teacher, this is extremely important that we keep up the good work and keep working on this enlightenment for the future of our society. That's what we have to do, and we need to keep doing that, whatever it costs, unfortunately. Right, so this being said, I will give you a little bit of housekeeping. So we're gonna have to speak around 15 minutes each. Then there's gonna be a Q&A at the end of the session. And also we are gonna share our PowerPoints if the broadband, and as the broadband could be slightly limited, we are gonna have to turn our cameras off and we can turn them on at the end for the Q&A, as I said earlier. Okay, in this session we're gonna have three speakers. So myself, Aude Le Guenec, Heriot-Watt University, School of Textiles and Design. I'm a designer anthropologist specializing in inclusive design for children. We have also Silvano Mendes, who is a researcher and sorry, Silvan, researcher and also a teacher at the IFM SMOD and currently undertaking a PhD with Paris 1 and the IFM on the scenography of fashion, if we can say it like this. And also Federica Marella, who is a specialist of luxury Italian fashion and will speak to us about the branding, the advertisement and branding in Italian luxury brands. But I will let you introduce yourselves slightly better when you start your presentation. So first of all here, I would like to speak today, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. I can do that. Okay. And I will stop the video. Okay. So what I'm going to speak to you about today is a work that I've been doing from 2006 until 2010 with Jacadi, who is one of the brands of the ID Kids community, which is one of the leader in terms of children's goods and children's fashion currently based in France. I've been working with them on the rebranding of Jacadi and finding a way to tell the pretend story of a brand who wanted to emphasize a link with the context of the Haussmannian capital and all the values which are related to that. Let's start with a little bit of context first. Sorry, I'm trying to move my slides. I hope that everybody can see my slides. I can't see the chat, so hopefully everything is all right. So I would like to ask you if you do remember this christening dress that you have passed through the generations. Do you remember these pajamas worn by all newborns in your household, like the one on the left-hand side, which belongs to my family? Do you treasure this re-edition of 1970s underwear purchased for your younger relatives? I would like to say that a sense of nostalgia is a constant in children's fashion, and the connection with the past is a motto for children's wear designers. This connection with the past seems like a constant for the fashion historians as well. Perusing children's wear of the late 1970s onwards seems like scrolling a timeline which, since the middle of the 19th century, plays around the repetition of similar shapes, features, and patterns. This timeless repertoire recurs from decade to decade and contributes to the connection between the generations, sharing common memories of pristine white dresses and preppy breeches. This sense of history and connection to the past as a core element of children's fashion echoes the position of children as a link between the past and the future. This nostalgia, which is a way to facilitate the continuity of identity between the older generations and their heirs, embeds children's material culture, bonds the generations mirroring each other through their styles, and allows children's socialization by the appropriation of this past in fashion. Therefore, for children's fashion brands evolving in a contemporary market where the past is valued and a centennial heritage treasured as a guarantee of reputation, emphasizes timeless inspirations and a long-lasting history is a continuous quest. For high street children's wear brands, mostly created after World War II during the expansion of the ready-to-wear market, and mostly in the 1970s, creating a sense of a long-lasting but pretend heritage, requires some creativity to compile a consistent story perceivable by the customers and the users. And here you can see a few examples of these heritage brands which are currently on the children's wear market. So in this presentation, I will reflect on the experience of Jacadi, a high street reputable children's wear heritage brand. I will introduce the methodology undertaken to ensure a consistent storytelling approach of the collections, communication and retail across all collaborators of the brand. And I will demonstrate how a visual and object-based research in a museum's collection, have provided a framework to ensure the consistent rebranding of a pretend heritage brand. Created in 1976, Jacadi is a French brand dedicated to children aged 0 to 12 years, supplying fashion, childcare, and furniture products. From its creation, Jacadi has been inspired by the nostalgic and preppy style of upper-class children in the early 20th century Europe, and incarnated a timeless chic à la française, which has contributed to its reputation. You can see here a few pictures from adverts dated back from the 1980s, 1990s, which show you the evolution of the brand in terms of communication and collections, and shows you as well the kind of inconsistency between the seasons and the collections in terms of style and positioning. In 2005, Jacadi joined the holding ID Kids community and undertook a thorough reflection on its branding, including the need to rethink the narrative of the collections, the communication, and the retail style. At this point in its history, this heritage brand was struggling to find an identity and was lost in a melting pot of inspirations, diverse interpretations of the notion of tradition and nostalgia in fashion, and unfocused creative directions. For ID-Kit community, the education and socialization process of a child aware of her role in the society, considered as a being and a becoming, is key. The respect of children as consumers, but more importantly as users and future adults, is a priority in the definition of the brand promises of the group. Therefore, defined by its nostalgic approach of childhood and the sense of transmission, Jacadi aimed to be anchored in a reinvented past. As an expert of European children's fashion history and the keeper of a textile and fashion museum dedicated to children's clothing and based in Cholet, in France, I was invited to contribute to the rebranding of the range. If the notion of heritage brand was blooming at this time, such an appetite to secure the legacy and positioning of a range dedicated to the overlooked children's ready-to-wear was extremely unusual. Undertaken between 2006 and 2010, the project that I coordinated in close partnership with the senior management of the company and the creative teams aimed to identify an original methodology to create a branding tool useful for all. The aims of this research focused on the needs to identify consistent inspirations for the design of the products as well as the communication and the retail style. It addressed the necessity to gather together a repertoire of inspirations and traditional features supporting the renewal of the creative direction. This collaborative research has contributed to the definition of a pretend centennial heritage for an only 40 years old children's fashion brand, which was looking at establishing its reputation and gaining more visibility. It has allowed the creation of a common brand culture for all the collaborators of the brand and accessible to the customers, reinforcing the position of Jacadi as a premium high street heritage brand for children. So there were several objectives to this research. The first one was to respond to the concept of nostalgia in childhood and to connect with the customers through the development of a children's wear brand based on the notion of transmission and heritage. The second objective was to establish Jacadi as a heritage and nostalgia brand with a consistent storytelling, inspiring the collections, retail, and communication. It was also to create a heritage-based brand culture for Jacadi, spread through the brand promise to all collaborators and, of course, understandable by the clients. To identify the appropriate methodology to create the branding chart and design platform, enhancing the storytelling inspired by the heritage of children's fashion and clothing was the most part of my mission for this brand. So first of all, the project started with the definition of the core values of the brand and their contextualization in history. What you can see here is the brand promise that has been written, I think in 2006 or 2007, to as a statement to embed into all the actions and activities of the group. So first of all, the work has been focused on defining a context, defining a story, writing a story, and finding the way to do that by choosing in the French history the moment, the time, and the place where Jacadi could share its values. So what you can see here is the first step of this research. Um, Jacques has identified that they had a lot in common, and they wanted to emphasize the Paris as the Osmanian capital. They were extremely interested in the opera, in what has been created, developed the social life under the Second Empire. Of course, the notion of bourgeoisie, the tradition, transmissions, and heritage within this upper class in France was something that where the brand was finding a lot of food to share with its customers and creative teams. And also, they were extremely interested in the childhood culture in the early 1900s. So all these elements, all these ingredients, contextual information have been put together to create the grounding of this brand and develop its pretend story, as I said. The visual analysis of the representations of childhood in the arts, literature, family archives, and the cultural environment of the time. So this corpus was analyzed during an original coding defined in conjunction with the strategy of the brand. This corpus was interpreted and combined in a functional way to form the grounding of the storytelling of the brand and to establish its creative signature and design platform. This original semiotic approach, combined with visual analysis and object-based research in fashion and textile heritage collections, with elements of design anthropology and storytelling, have constituted the methodology used in this project. So, from the constitution of a visual database, we have then moved to the visual definition of the brand to allow then the creation of design chart, of a design platform based on the visual analysis of the representative pictures, representative illustrations of the brand. So we've done something which is called the Proust questionnaire, or Chinese questionnaire. And in this questionnaire, we've asked if Jacques was, for example, an object, or if Jacques was a story, a moment in life, memories of childhood, what would this be? And we've decided to picked up these illustrations of object, life, memories, moment of childhood, etc. in the context, in the historical context, which we had identified as being connected to the values of the brand. So you can see here the result of this visual database, or very tiny results, and all of that has been visually analyzed thanks to a visual analysis methodology that I will present to you in a minute. The database is also inspired by the contextualized childhood culture to inform the design platform. This is how we've analyzed the pictures collected in this database. We have focused on the effect, the sensations, the scenography, the products that were represented on each of these illustrations to then create referentials and further databases which were spread into the design platform and branding and used in the branding of the collections. One example of that is the work done on the emblématique. So this is extremely illustrative of the way we've been using objects, archives, analyzing these objects to then inspire the new collections. And we've combined that with visual materials, visual archives selected in museum collections or elsewhere, to then create what you can see in the middle of the screen, a product here, a knickerbockers inspired by the original garments worn by children at the beginning of the 20th century. And this research has been pushed further by in developing the narrative of each of these archive garments, and communicating them directly in the retail, in the shops, to be visible to the clients. Of course, this research crossing archive objects, illustrations, etc., has been developed in a variation of ways, in a variety of ways, this goes from the label on the cloth up until the advertisement, but also all the boxes, ribbons, packaging used in the retail and communicated directly to the client. And of course, this research, this pretend story, this rebranded visual interpretation, this new visual interpretation of the brand has been spread on internet, used in the digital communication of the brand as well. So this database has developed into consistent repertoire, digitalized and designed for the teams in charge of the creation of the collections, the communication and the retail, as the root of a solid corporate culture. This heritage platform has been used upstream to secure a consistent approach to the narrative of the collections, and downstream to communicate this story to the customers, to the children as users, and their parents as buyers. Finally, reflecting on the model established thanks to this experience, the dissemination of this research to the collaborators of the brand has been held during all staff training workshops and creative support that have been developed in the context of this mission. This project management has been able to create a participative corporate culture fed by a strong sense of transmission and heritage, and contributing to the perpetuation of the context of the concept of nostalgia in childhood outside the sole consideration for the needs of the market. This contextualized case study has since then allowed the creation of a branding and creative tool, allowing further in-depth interpretation and connection with the customers of heritage brands. Thank you very much. And we will take the questions at the end of the presentation. Okay. Silvano?
Yes.
Are you ready? So Silvano is going to speak now about the Café Parisien.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
First of all, sorry, but I do my presentation in French because I just realized when I received the program that we were few to do in French, and yeah, so it's gonna be in French. I'm sorry. Cette communication, je vais juste ouvrir mon écran. Voilà, partager mon écran. Et OK. Alors, j'espère que ça marche pour vous.
Ça fonctionne, c'est bon.
Très bien. Alors, donc, cette communication, elle fait partie d'un projet de recherche plus large, dans le cadre d'une thèse inscrite dans le parcours doctoral théorie et pratique de la mode, qui est le fruit d'un partenariat entre l'IFM et l'université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. Donc, dans cette thèse, je m'intéresse à la façon dont les marques de mode s'approprient l'espace, s'approprient et utilisent l'espace comme un élément de discours, voire un outil de communication, que ce soit dans les défilés ou les lieux de vente, entre autres. Alors, les idées qui vont être présentées ici sont donc issues d'une réflexion qui est en cours, donc il n'y aura pas de conclusion très arrêtée, puisqu'il s'agit des pistes de recherche en devenir plutôt que des conclusions définitives. Ceci étant dit, le sujet que je présente aujourd'hui se concentre sur l'un des aspects de la mise en espace de la mode, dans lequel on met en scène autre chose que le vêtement. Je vais vous parler des restaurants des marques de mode. Eh bien, plusieurs marques se sont lancées récemment dans la restauration et mon intérêt par ce sujet a été déclenché notamment par l'inauguration en février dernier du Sugala Bové et du Café V, le premier restaurant et le premier café ouvert par la maison Louis Vuitton. Eh bien, ces deux projets ont été inaugurés à Osaka, au dernier étage de la nouvelle boutique Vuitton. Pour la modique somme de 275 $, le prix moyen d'un repas à la carte, on peut manger dans la nouvelle maison Vuitton. J'ai dit nouvelle maison parce que c'est désormais le terme utilisé par Vuitton pour décrire non plus la marque, mais plutôt les flagship stores de la marque. Et on va y revenir. Au-delà de Vuitton, d'autres marques de mode se sont lancées récemment dans la restauration et pas uniquement des marques de luxe. APC, par exemple, a ouvert un café éphémère au sein d'une galerie au Palais Royal ici à Paris, c'est l'image que vous voyez à gauche, tandis que la marque Sezoom a ouvert un restaurant qui s'appelle Alma au mois de novembre à Marseille, donc c'est l'image de droite. D'ailleurs, ce phénomène n'est pas nouveau, hein. Paul Poiret avait créé un restaurant spécialement conçu pour l'exposition universelle de 1925 à Paris. Construit sur une péniche, ces restaurants, qui s'appelaient Délices, avaient une vingtaine de tables et s'inscrivaient dans la logique de Poiret, qui consistait déjà à l'époque à créer un univers de marque qui dépassait les vêtements avec des produits dérivés, mais aussi avec un attrait par l'événementiel. Et la création d'un restaurant regroupait donc ces deux éléments, le produit dérivé et l'événementiel. Mais les restaurants de marque contemporains, ils s'inscrivent plutôt dans une optique qu'on appelle dans le marketing le consumption experience. Ce concept théorisé au début des années 80, notamment par Holbrook et Hirschman, pour décrire l'impact de la dimension émotionnelle et des caractéristiques multisensorielles impliquées dans l'acte d'achat. Et d'une certaine façon, il s'agit de la théorisation de toutes les animations qui existent notamment depuis la création des grands magasins et qu'Émile Zola mettait en récit déjà à la fin du 19e siècle. En gros, ce sont tous les éléments qui rendent l'acte d'achat, ou en tout cas le moment pendant lequel on est dans un lieu de vente, plus agréable. Ça peut être par la création des espaces d'exposition d'objets d'art, dans une idée d'artialisation des boutiques de luxe, comme l'ont théorisé notamment Gilles Lipovetsky et Véronica Manno, ou comme ici, dans le cas traité aujourd'hui, par des projets de type gastronomique. Alors, c'est l'idée, en gros, de réunir dans un même endroit les fameux 3 F de Holbrook et Hirschman, c'est-à-dire Fantasies, Feelings and Fun. Et au milieu de toutes ces expériences proposées, les restaurants de marque de mode sont un exemple assez intéressant, notamment parce qu'ils s'inscrivent dans la construction d'une narrative qui consiste à faire consommer une marque et son univers plus que les produits habituels. Si on devait schématiser, on pourrait dire qu'il y a 3 types de projets de restaurants créés par les marques de mode. Il y a d'abord les cafés dans les magasins, avec des projets qui ont souvent une empreinte plus discrète dans le lieu de vente. Ils servent comme un espace de pause pour les clients. On pourrait prendre l'exemple de café de la boutique Saint-Laurent à rive droite, ou encore le salon de thé et le plongeoir au sein de la boutique Hermès rive gauche. Puis, il y a les projets éphémères, comme le café APC à la galerie Joyce au Palais Royal, qu'on avait évoqué tout à l'heure, et qui est resté ouvert pendant seulement 2 mois. Et il y a les projets de restaurants ou des cafés qui sont bâtis par les marques de mode de A à Z, seuls ou avec des partenaires. C'est le cas de Gucci Osteria à Florence et à Los Angeles. C'est le cas du restaurant Beige, ouvert par la maison Chanel au dernier étage de la boutique à Tokyo, avec Alain Ducasse. Et aussi les différents restaurants de Ralph Lauren, dont celui de Paris que nous voyons à l'écran. Ou encore l'Harmonie Café et l'Harmonie Restaurant, dont le concept a été créé il y a plus de 20 ans et qui vient de réouvrir ses portes à Paris. Pour les créateurs, ce genre de projet est souvent présenté comme étant une évidence, comme pour Giorgio Armani, qui parle du restaurant parisien comme étant une suite logique dans un projet de construction de ce qu'il appelle un style de vie Armani complet. Le tout dans un principe de diffusion de bon goût par les codes partagés entre le monde de la mode, la gastronomie et même l'architecture. Il faut préciser que toutes ces initiatives citées, elles vont bien au-delà des projets comme celui de Pierre Cardin, qui avait acheté le restaurant Maxim's dans les années 80, et pour lui, c'était juste une affaire en plus. C'est pas non plus une extension de gamme, comme quand on lance une nouvelle ligne de chaussures. Dans la plupart de ces nouveaux projets, il s'agit plutôt de consolider l'image de la marque de mode en tant qu'acteur de lifestyle. Il y a, quand on analyse un peu de plus près, on se rend compte qu'il y a un intérêt très pratique derrière ces mariages de circonstances, si on pourrait dire, entre la mode et la restauration. D'abord, cela permet de rendre la marque plus accessible. Après tout, il est plus facile de prendre un thé chez Hermès que d'acheter un carré en soie dans la même boutique. Puis, ces projets, ils encouragent les acheteurs à rester plus longtemps dans les magasins, surtout quand il s'agit d'un établissement de restauration qui est situé au sein même de lieux de vente, chose très importante en ce moment, d'abord parce qu'il y a le contexte de commerce en ligne qui gagne force, mais aussi, encore plus récemment, dans le contexte post-pandémie qui éloigne les clients des boutiques physiques. Ensuite, d'un point de vue d'image, cela fait parler de la marque au-delà de la période des défilés, au-delà de la période de lancement des collections, mais aussi permet de faire parler de la marque dans d'autres supports médiatiques que la presse de mode, comme par exemple les magazines et les sites internet gastronomiques. Et surtout, cela permet de renforcer l'empreinte de l'identité de la marque dans l'espace, notamment par le rappel de certains éléments de son ADN, comme les codes couleurs, par exemple. On le voit avec l'usage de grège chez Armani à Paris, l'usage de beige chez Chanel à Tokyo, d'ailleurs c'est le nom du restaurant, et toutes les tonalités de marron qu'on a vu plus tôt chez Sugala Bove, donc le restaurant de Louis Vuitton à Osaka. Mais au-delà de cette approche un peu de marketing visuel, il est intéressant d'analyser ce projet de diversification d'un point de vue plus sociologique, voire philosophique. Parce qu'après tout, on consomme certes l'univers de la marque, mais on consomme aussi l'espace. Et là, je me penche sur les écrits d'Henri Lefebvre, notamment dans la production de l'espace, quand il fait une hiérarchisation assez pertinente pour notre étude. En gros, il met d'un côté les espaces de consommation et de l'autre la consommation de l'espace. Selon Lefebvre, les espaces de consommation sont des espaces d'accumulation de capital, celui du marché, ou tout simplement, en ce qui nous concerne, les espaces commerciaux. Tandis que la consommation de l'espace est cette consommation qui est présente comme étant improductive, par exemple le loisir et le tourisme. Et si l'on suit le raisonnement de Lefebvre, on remarque que l'espace de consommation est quantifié, on pourrait même dire quantifiable. On connaît par exemple l'étendue d'un réseau de points de vente de telle ou telle marque très facilement en regardant sur son site internet. En revanche, la consommation de l'espace est moins quantifiable. voulais me concentrer quelques instants sur deux lieux de restauration à Paris installés au même endroit et appartenant à la même marque. Je fais référence donc aux deux projets de Jacques Mus aux Galeries Lafayette des Champs-Élysées. D'un côté, nous avons le Citron, c'est une sorte de cantine aux inspirations méditerranéennes au milieu des espaces de vente, juste à côté des portants qui vendent des vêtements Jacques Mus. Et de l'autre, l'image de droite, nous avons au deuxième étage l'Oursin, un restaurant plutôt gastronomique ouvert en partenariat avec Caviar Caspia. Il faut savoir que l'ouverture de ces deux restaurants l'année dernière a suscité beaucoup d'intérêt de la part de la presse de mode, bien évidemment, mais aussi la presse gastronomique, disons fooding, ou la presse de décoration. Le magazine de design intérieur AD, par exemple, présentait l'oursin comme étant, je cite, sans doute la meilleure table de quartier pour déguster une cuisine tentée de saveurs méditerranéennes, soit une vision fantasmée de son sud natal, donc celui de Jacques Mus, où se mêle le parfum de Grèce et de province, dont il avait déjà esquissé les contours avec le café Citron. Ce qui est intéressant de remarquer, c'est que ces deux projets appartiennent à Simon Porte-Jacques Mus, qui est un créateur qui, malgré son jeune âge et la marque qui a à peine 10 ans, est déjà dans une démarche d'héritage, dans une volonté réelle de laisser une trace derrière lui et de passer à la postérité. D'ailleurs, Jacques Mus lui-même ne cache pas cette volonté. Comme quand il dit lors d'une interview au journal Le Monde à l'occasion des 10 ans de sa marque l'année dernière, qu'il garde systématiquement une pièce de toutes ses créations dans le but de créer plus tard. Et le fait d'avoir un restaurant et un café sur les Champs-Élysées à Paris, même si cela ne porte pas vraiment son nom, fait aussi partie de cette idée de bâtir un patrimoine de l'ordre de l'affectif. D'ailleurs, si on devait résumer la narrative de Jacques Mus en un seul élément, on pourrait dire facilement que la dimension affective, elle est au cœur de son discours. Une dimension affective qui s'exprime notamment par son attachement à sa famille, son attachement au sud de la France, qu'il essaye de mettre en avant constamment. Donc, avoir un restaurant contribue à cette construction d'un patrimoine immatériel et affectif. On retrouve aussi cette idée d'héritage exprimée autrement, également dans la boutique Christian Dior à Séoul, en Corée du Sud. Au dernier étage de la boutique, dans ce bâtiment imaginé par Christian de Porzenpack, il y a un bar-restaurant dans lequel le client retrouve certains des codes de la maison, comme les murs peints en gris Trianon, décorés de boiseries, caractéristiques de la boutique historique de l'avenue Montaigne à Paris. Mais surtout, nous sommes accueillis dès la sortie de l'ascenseur par un portrait de Christian Dior sur les murs et aussi plusieurs croquis historiques, comme pour rappeler la présence de fondateurs de la maison malgré les 9000 km qui séparent la boutique de Séoul de l'avenue Montaigne à Paris et pour renforcer par cette empreinte dans l'espace physique la notion d'héritage symbolique. Donc, le restaurant de marque, il est une sorte d'extension de Brandscape, ces néologismes développés par le journaliste Otto Rivolt, utilisés pour parler de la contraction entre brand, la marque, et landscape, le paysage. Ce concept de brandscape, il essaye d'aller au-delà de l'idée de entertainment retail, pour parler de tous ces lieux qui transcrivent la totalité de l'identité de la marque en allant de l'aménagement de l'espace à la disposition des produits dans les vitrines, en passant par l'architecture d'extérieur du bâtiment, le tout avec un ancrage très émotionnel. D'ailleurs, la volonté de la marque Louis Vuitton d'utiliser le mot maison, qu'on a vu au début de la présentation pour ses flagships, est assez révélatrice de cette volonté de créer un brand space. Et si le flagship store ou le navire amiral d'une marque est l'incarnation de ce brand space, le restaurant, d'une certaine façon, est la dimension la plus humaine de ce concept. Et cela nous fait revenir à une hypothèse que je vous présente ici en m'appuyant notamment sur les écrits de Ray Oldenburg. Dans son livre The Great Good Place, ce sociologue américain qui s'intéresse notamment à la sociologie urbaine, il a produit à la fin des années 80 le concept de third place, donc le tiers-lieu. Selon lui, the first place est la maison, the second place est le lieu de travail et le third place, donc ce tiers-lieu, est une sorte de lieu intermédiaire où, entre autres, les personnes peuvent se réunir en dehors des cadres professionnels et résidentiels. Ces tiers-lieux d'Oldenburg peuvent être donc les pubs, les cafés du coin et tous les commerces qui favorisent les relations et les échanges entre les individus. Il faut rappeler que Oldenburg, il parlait dans un contexte historique précis, qui était celui du déclin de la vie sociale dans les banlieues américaines qu'il étudiait à l'époque. Et aujourd'hui, même ces tiers-lieux physiques qui incarnent des lieux de sociabilité commencent à disparaître petit à petit au détriment des lieux de rassemblement numérique qui sont les réseaux sociaux. Mais ça, c'est un autre sujet. On va rester concentré ici sur la problématique des cafés parce qu'il s'agit, après tout, d'analyser le rôle d'un lieu de convivialité et de sociabilité, un café ou un restaurant, qui a été créé à la base dans le but de vendre des produits alimentaires, un café ou un repas, mais en même temps qui existe aussi et surtout pour créer un engouement autour d'une marque de vêtements. Dans ce cas, si on suit un peu les pas d'Oldenburg, on pourrait se demander si les restaurants et les cafés de marque de mode ne seraient pas finalement une sorte de quatrième lieu, un concept que je présente ici, qui serait beaucoup plus hybride, notamment par sa dimension communicante. Parce que si on emprunte à nouveau les termes d'Henri Lefebvre, les restaurants de marque pourraient être aussi un espace de représentation. En réalité, si on creuse un peu, on se rend compte que les restaurants et les cafés de marque ne sont pas des espaces de représentation, mais plutôt des représentations de l'espace. Ces deux concepts sur lesquels Lefebvre travaille dans son œuvre. Et contrairement à ce qu'on pourrait penser, dans un restaurant de mode ou dans un restaurant à la mode, on n'est pas vraiment dans une notion d'espace public d'apparition. Cette notion d'Hannah Arendt employée pour décrire les espaces d'apparence, où la liberté pourrait devenir une réalité. On est beaucoup plus proche de l'espace contrôlé, voire surveillé, théorisé notamment par Michel Foucault. Il est évident que l'usager slash consommateur n'est pas voué à la passivité et à la discipline. D'ailleurs, Michel de Certeau, qui s'y oppose à cette idée de soumission et de contrôle développée par Foucault, l'a très bien montré dans son livre L'invention du quotidien. Néanmoins, si l'on s'arrête rapidement sur de Certeau, il dit quand même entre les lignes que le mot consommateur est seulement une manière pudique de cacher d'une certaine façon le statut de dominé. Donc, en intervenant sur nos espaces de convivialité, un repas, un café entre amis, les marques de mode interviennent dans notre notion de quotidien. Ou alors, comme dirait De Certeau, les marques réinventent notre quotidien. D'ailleurs, le défilé Chanel automne-hiver 2015-2016, je sors un peu des cafés, mais c'est intéressant comme exemple, qui a recréé un bistrot parisien comme décor, montre de façon presque ironique cette réinvention du quotidien par l'appropriation de nos espaces de convivialité. Et je termine avec une dernière référence, celle de Jean Baudrillard dans Le système des objets, qui disait que les vitrines d'un magasin étaient le lieu où, je cite, toute une société s'homogénéise par acculturation quotidienne incessante à la logique silencieuse et spectaculaire de la mode. Le problème avec ces restaurants et cafés de marque, c'est que nous risquons de devenir des acteurs de cette homogénéisation puisque nous sommes entre l'espace de représentation et la représentation de l'espace. Et en plus, le numérique et les réseaux sociaux ajoutent une épaisseur performative chez les consommateurs / usagers qui postent des photos de leur passage dans les restaurants et les cafés en question, ce qui renforce à son tour justement la dimension performative de ces espaces. Mais plus important que de savoir, et j'ai conclu, qui entre le client et le lieu est le plus performatif, le plus intéressant est de constater qu'en se posant à l'intérieur des vitrines, qui sont ces cafés et ces restaurants, on participe, pas toujours de manière volontaire, à une stratégie d'occupation de l'espace réel et espace virtuel des marques de mode. Et on sait très bien qu'occuper l'espace, voire maîtriser l'espace, c'est aussi maîtriser le pouvoir. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Silvano, pour cette présentation fascinante des cafés de mode et pas toujours parisiens. Donc, toutes mes excuses pour mon introduction. qui, je l'espère, nous vaudra beaucoup de votre présentation, je l'espère, nous vaudra beaucoup de questions à la fin de ce panel. We're gonna now hear Federica Mayala, who will present on research on Italian luxury brands in and their advertisement campaigns. Over to you, Federica.
Yes, hi everybody. Okay, now I share my screen. Okay, so you can see everything, it's okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So, hi everybody. I'm talking today about my PhD thesis that has been published in 2019, last year, by Arachne Editrice, about consumerism and female iconography, women in the advertising campaigns of the major Italian luxury brands, years 2010-2015. So, my book Iconografia del consumo, la costruzione dell'immagine femminile tra moda, arte e pubblicità is my PhD thesis where I analyze the female representation in the major Italian luxury pret-a-porter brand advertising campaigns during the years 2010-2015. I decided to present here the conclusion of my thesis that I partly already narrated at the GFC 2016 in Stockholm, when I talk about the particular case of Dolce & Gabbana advertising campaigns. You can see here the book. So my project has its roots in 3 areas of study: iconography and art history, gender studies, fashion photography, luxury, and advertisement. You can see here some of the most important books and works that I read and studied, obviously Gombrich on Aby Warburg, Linda Nochlin, Jordi de Huberin, Judith Butler, Silvana Capecchi, and so on. Obviously, Erwin Goffman with gender advertisement, and so others, so many works about this kind of studies. But most of the recent researches look at women's magazines as a whole, analyzing advertising campaigns, editorials, and pictures outline articles. On the contrary, my research has focused only on fashion photography, particularly on the advertising campaigns. You can see here some of the most recent research about fashion, but not on fashion photography, on under advertising campaigns. There is a particular way to communicate. So the main objective of my PhD thesis, it has been to study women's representation in advertising campaigns of luxury pret-a-porter Italian brands during the years 2010-2015 women wear section, adjoin the iconographic method to a new object of research, that of fashion photography. For what concerns the method, I have chosen to analyze only the Italian brand of luxury pret-a-porter, starting from a Pan Bianco research realized in 2014. Prada, Gucci, Giorgio Armani, Ferragamo, Bottega Veneta, Dolce & Gabbana, Versace, Roberto Cavalli. These are the most richer brands of Italian luxury pret-a-porter for those research. I have selected then 1 image for each campaign, coming to a total of 88 images. For what concerns the analysis, my research starts with the identification of female representation from an artistic, philosophical, and archetypal point of view. First, my analysis focuses on the archetypes and fashion bodies in fashion photography and fashion advertising described by Muzzarelli in 2013 and Grandi in 2001. But first, I looked for this representation in my corpus of images, but then I searched for new female images, starting from the female iconography of art of the art of all times. So I used the iconographic method by Aby Warburg, for example, in the fashion contemporary photography. In this conference, we'll talk about the result of the iconographic analysis years 2010-2015. And here you can see the table 2, that is the explanatory summary of my new representation of the fashion bodies and of the female archetypes in the 8 brands. So here is difficult to explain in 15 minutes. So I invite you maybe to read it on the paper or on the book. So you can see here the archetypes and female representation or fashion bodies from Muzzarelli, Grandi, and others great images in art history. You can see in bold my new representation, my new fashion bodies found thanks to the iconographic method. I thought so to concentrate a bit on my research, my method of iconographic style and analysis. So I choose one example for each brand. You can see here, for example, Summer Spring 2010 in Prada, this woman that recalls in its pose and lines and semiotic to the ecstasy of the Baroque art. For example, here you can see the ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Lorenzo Bernini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, or also here the Mary Magdalene by Caravaggio. And you can see here some spots of the advertising campaign of Prada those years. And this I call the ecstatic woman. This is one of my new female representation that I found. Then in Gucci, I found the Danae woman. You can see here summer, spring, winter, fall, these women, these details of women in the advertising campaigns that had recalled to me the Danae of the art history, of the academic art history, and also the recalls of the iconography in art history too. The Baroque ecstasy of the Venus or Danae here is recalled also in the women represented in the pre-romanticism with Heinrich Füssli, the Nightmare. You can see here Artemisia Gentileschi Danae or Comer Danae and the Gold Rain. These are beautiful women, horizontal, taking the power of a god, a sexual power that you can see perfectly also here in this so many representations, so many advertising campaigns by Gucci. For Giorgio Armani, I decided to underline the faceless woman that I found in summer, spring 2014 and winter, fall 2012 and 13. The faceless woman is another new representation that I found thanks to the iconographic method that obviously recalls the Disquieting Muses by Giorgio de Chirico, or Erwin Blumenfeld with his Modesty in 1938, or also nowadays, for example, Pierre Deboucher, when he portrays Beyoncé Knowles in a Sea Air fashion book in 2014. Ferragamo, here another new representation. This is not my new representation, but is an iconic representation of female in art. This is the typical representation discovered by Aby Warburg, the master, the teacher, the creator of iconography. He created the nymph in art history. So you can see here in Ferragamo, winter, fall 2010-2011, this woman that recalls the Nike of Samotracia or the Ghirlandaio detail of Cappella Tornabuoni, or so many others women dancing and nymph and Maenad in art history, also in Greek art, in Roman art, in Renaissance art, and so on. So in all the centuries of art history. This is one particular new representation that I invented, that I found in Bottega Veneta, for example, the woman sola et pensosa pre-Raphaelite. Sola et pensosa, recalling and quoting Francesco Petrarca, but it's a sentence of pre-Raphaelite idea of art also. So these beautiful women of the pre-Raphaelite group of artists in the half 19th century in London, that recalls the Petrarca and the medieval art and culture. And this kind of women, beautiful women with white skin, with this glance that is totally overthinking and sad and melancholic, it's so present in Bottega Veneta Winter Fall 2013 or 14, or also here in Summer Spring with Dante Gabriele Rossetti, or also here Summer Spring 2014. This beautiful woman, this beautiful model and image that recalls the Proserpina by Dante Gabriele Rossetti. Dolce & Gabbana is the brand that I talk about, of which I spoke about in 2016 here at the Global Fashion Conference Stockholm. And it has been also published by Mondadori, this paper, because I think that Dolce & Gabbana in those years, I know there are a lot of problems in Dolce & Gabbana female imaging before in the 90s. But in these years, there is a very powerful representation of women, also a bit ironic, as you can see here, this warrior woman that recalls the emancipated woman in 1871 by an anonymous, or here, the Sicilia Madonna woman, this beautiful image with Bianca Balti that recalls the structure, the power, and the Renaissance ideal of the Sicilian artist Antonello da Messina. This beautiful image by Versace, Summer Spring 2013, recalls the image of woman in Pietà. So the man who's lying on the belly of a woman. That is something very brand new, generally, because generally it's the woman in the traditional iconography on the feet of a man, calling the crucifixion, for example. But here is a man lying on the chest here of a woman, and this image is very iconical. Or Roberto Cavalli, for example, this is a new body that I found, the multicultural body that you can see here in Summer Spring 2012 or Winter Fall 2013 and 14. So in this way, maybe if you're interested in, you can maybe better understand this table with the number of percentage of this old and minute representation that I found and that I studied in each image of this advertising campaigns of these 8 brands. So first interpretation, firstly, we observe a constant contrast between fashion bodies, representation, and archetypes. On one side, the powerful and emancipated one, like the femme fatale. On the other side, the traditional and weak ones. This representation brings to a confused and conflicting identity of the contemporary woman, the representation of a fragmented woman. Second, this dissociated woman is the result of representations, archetypes, and fashion bodies that are themselves contradictory. For example, the androgynous woman is generally seen, for example, in Armani also, a powerful woman because she reminds a man. So the question is, why a woman to resemble strong, she has to lose her femininity or her curves, or the femme fatale, for example, she is the typical ideal, a strong woman, a powerful woman, but at the same time, if we think or to Salome or the Judith in art history, at the same time is a woman who is going to kill you, so you have to be afraid of her. So it's a kind of contradictory ideal of archetypes of women. Another element that stands out is a contrast with society and the contemporary star system. I think this point is interesting because the new fashion icons that are appearing in the eyes of the viewer in magazine, printed and online are curvy women. The curvy body is a recent theme of discussion, a daily topic in every fashion magazine. But I noticed that in these results, the skeletal body, the virtual body, the androgynous woman, so very skinny, are the body that are most used. So the curvy body is so powerful maybe on Instagram, on social network, in the star system, but not in fashion magazine, not in advertising campaigns. But I found something interesting that it's changing for what concerns the multicultural body that you have seen here in, for example, in Roberto Cavalli. So the multicultural body, I found it in 4 brands on 8. And it's interesting because it's going away from this idea of exotic woman that is typical of the colonialist thoughts of the Western world. And so the multicultural way of representation, the daily life, the daily different culture, it's something that maybe, I hope, is going to change. And it's changing also in these fashion advertising campaigns. So for what concerns my conclusions, I quote, I wrote here a quotation by Marshall McLuhan in 1984. Isn't it wonderful how advertising agencies create symbols for a common state of mind? So this is obviously a provocative question, or also something to think about, this idea of images that creates our world, in some way reflects our desires, in some way also represents our fears maybe, or our desires, what we love to see, what we love to be. And as preliminary results, I have found a strong link, in fact, between the iconography and historicized art and the iconography and contemporary fashion photography. Then I found that the analysis that the female representation are more than those listed by Muzzarelli in 2013, more than those listed, the fashion body lists by Grandi in 2001. There are new experiments and new female representation that I found in this research. Maybe there could be others found by someone else, I don't know. But I found this new representation thanks to the iconographical method of an art historian, because I am an art historian. And so I found also new representation that are including a close connection between the world of fashion, literature, art, cinema, and social history and music. Finally, I can suggest a social link between imagery and contemporary society. Future perspective and ideas. So among the possible further research, I think there could be so many interesting ideas for new possible researches. I can tell that it could be interesting to deepen the union between the iconographic study of images and contemporary social reality. Furthermore, it would be interesting to develop research in the same years, both of the female iconography of foreign brands, and even more in line with this path, of the male representation, always in Italian brands. So how men are representing the same years from these brands. A parallel path could also be that of studying female iconography in fashion artistic photography. So fashion artistic photography is in some way independent from the consumerism, from the idea of the brand identity. So it could be interesting to find if something is different in the fashion photography system, artistic fashion photography. And it will also be interesting to deepen the feminine gaze on the woman. So a female photographer, is she different representing women or not, or everything it's the same as the male gaze on women? And also it could be interesting to study the advertising campaigns of these brands in different countries to make a parallelism and a social analysis of the women image all over the world. So thank you so much for your attention, and my acknowledgement are my relator, Professor Nello Barile in Yulman University in Milan, and Arachne Editrice Rome, that has published my book. So if you have any questions or critics or a curiosity, just you can write me. This is my email address, and this is the title and the link of my book if you are interested in reading it. Thank you so much, and a big egg from Italy.
Thank you very much, Federica. This was another very, very interesting presentation. Now we've got a few, well, more than a few minutes, I would think, for the attendants to ask any question. I take that, well, I can actually translate any French question in the chat. So if you want to ask a question in English to us, please, or in French, sorry, please don't hesitate. And I will operate a quick translation if this is useful for the audience. Could you please, Federica, stop sharing your screen? Thank you very much. And maybe Silvano, you can put your camera on. Thank you very much. Is there any question for any of us from the audience? Des questions particulières?
Hello
Damien.
everyone. Bonjour Aude.
Bonjour. Ouais.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for all these very interesting presentations. I wanted to have just one question to Federica. I think you had a very interesting view on this connection between art history and fashion. I am myself an art historian, so I was very happy to see all this new way to use iconography and workbook system. So it was very interesting. I wanted to ask you actually a question about the different ad campaigns that you're studying, especially the role of the mood board that most of the people are using, the mood board with this different images that are actually kind of grasping workbook ideas, putting images together and making connections and link. Did you have the time in your PhD to study, or at least to consider this mood board, especially for the ad campaigns that you were showing?
Do you say about mood board that it's the brand identity, or the mood board of art history in the past?
Like the preparation, I don't know if you call that, in English, when they are gathering different images and different inspiration for their.
Okay, so in my opinion, I think that in fashion brands, there is a mixed job between brand identity and the photographer and the desire of people and the consumerism. So it's a very huge reality. So for what concerns the idea of the iconographic images, I think that the fashion photographer knows art. So it creates also consciously or not consciously, images of women that are in our DNA. And so also in the eyes of a photographer, of an artist. So I think that it's very hard, like, to express this, to study this, because it's like entering the minds of people, of artists. And I can say that Abivargo become mad studying the nymph and Mnemosyne and his Atlants and so on. So I think that there are some cultural DNA ideas, cultural visual ideas of women and men. Also, Erving Goffman said so, told so in the 1978 with gender advertisement. So he studied the advertising campaigns in America, and it underlined that there was something that was repeated, like, for example, children lying always on a bed or on the streets, like women, children and women lying. On the contrary, men always standing. And there are something that are repeating in our way of creating and of looking at it. So I think that an artist, a photographer, knows what the brand wants. At the same time, he wants to be free to create. At the same time, he has also his style. So Steven Meisel is different from Ferdinando Scianna, that is different from another photographer, or Annie Leibovitz, and so on, for fashion photography. So it's a mix of things, I think.
Thank you very much. And Thank you. I just have one more quick question to Silvano. J'ai une autre question pour Silvano. Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation, Silvano, de cette vision des restaurants actuels et surtout de cette théorie du quatrième lieu que je trouve vraiment très intéressante. J'avais une question justement à ce sujet. Est-ce que dans l'ensemble des différents exemples que vous avez évoqués, la place de plus en plus importante du cuisinier, du chef, est-ce que vous avez justement vu des choses à ce sujet? Puisqu'on voit alors, c'est un phénomène médiatique important, mais de plus en plus le chef, a une personnalité, a une image, a une singularité et je me demandais justement si les marques, de mode en particulier, heu, attachaient enfin arrimaient, je voulais dire, leur stratégie de communication à partir de ce phénomène actuel du chef et de la cuisine comme une sorte de nouvelle star en fait, médiatique, si je puis dire.
Oui, oui, oui. Merci pour la question. C'est intéressant parce qu'il y a deux aspects justement de personnages qui rentrent en ligne de compte dans cette valorisation de ces lieux. D'abord, il y a l'architecte pour la construction, ou le décorateur, ou le designer d'intérieur, pour l'espace même de ces lieux. Et de plus en plus, on voit la mise en avant des cuisiniers, des chefs. Par exemple, le projet de Chanel, le restaurant belge à Tokyo, on dit clairement que c'est un restaurant Chanel Alain Ducasse. Et à chaque fois qu'on le voit dans les photos, on voit toujours les deux noms qui sont associés. À Paris, le projet de Jacques Mus, d'un côté, le restaurant, c'est un partenariat avec Caspia Caviar. Donc déjà, il y a une sorte de label de qualité et de bon goût, si on veut. Mais surtout, il y a une chef étoilée qui signe la carte. Donc il y a une volonté de, comme on a fait par le passé avec les boutiques qui essayent de mettre en avant les star-architectes, ces grands noms de l'architecture comme étant l'auteur, j'utilise bien le mot auteur du bâtiment. Aujourd'hui, on voit de plus en plus la mise en avant des chefs qui tiennent un peu les fourneaux de ces restaurants. C'est un aspect intéressant et je commence à voir de plus en plus, effectivement.
Merci beaucoup Sylvano.
Merci. Je crois qu'il y a une autre question pour... Sorry, there's another question for Silvano in the chat. Nous ne sommes pas très nombreux. Peut-être que Léna veut poser sa question directement.
Oui, bonjour, mais je ne suis pas certaine de pouvoir la poser en anglais alors. Hein.
Faites-le en français comme vous voulez.
Bonjour Sylvain, pardon. Ben voilà, oui, vous vous en doutez, hein, vous connaissez un peu mon travail, donc ça m'a beaucoup intéressé à votre présentation. Et pour reformuler un peu ma question, dans la mesure où le fait de fréquenter tel ou tel autre restaurant de marque de mode ne peut pas être dissocié de la marque de mode en question, que ce soit un lieu qui est donc implanté à l'intérieur d'un espace marchand ou de façon autonome, je me demande si au sein donc de cette notion que vous avancez et qui est fort intéressante, en effet, je rejoins Damien, donc il y a la notion de quatrième lieu, on ne peut pas éventuellement considérer que d'un point de vue symbolique, mental, conceptuel, c'est la marque qui se spatialise d'une certaine façon, d'un point de vue métaphorique, et qui constitue justement ces quatrièmes lieux, lui-même représenté aussi bien par les restaurants, mais aussi par d'autres espaces marchands qui appellent à la fréquentation au temps de la pause, de la détente, du divertissement, etc. C'est juste une hypothèse voilà, qui suscite de la discussion.
Tout à fait. Non, c'est une hypothèse très intéressante parce que je vois, aujourd'hui, j'ai voulu parler des restaurants, mais il y a d'autres aspects dans lesquels on voit cette volonté des marques d'occuper littéralement l'espace et de transformer ou de rendre cet espace beaucoup plus mode pour justement multiplier sa visibilité. Et le restaurant, c'est juste un de ces possibles quatrièmes lieux. On pourrait parler des expositions qui sont sponsorisées ou pas par les marques, mais dans lesquelles les marques sont présentes. On pourrait parler aussi des animations qui sont organisées. Par exemple, je me souviens de Dior qui avait participé à des événements liés à des fleuristes. Donc, cette occupation des jardins par une marque qui a dans son ADN le lien avec les fleurs. Donc, non, effectivement, il y a... et aussi, ce qui m'intéressait dans cette recherche, c'est qu'on parle très souvent de le temps quand on parle de la mode et un peu moins de l'espace, de l'occupation de l'espace. Et on se rend compte que la mode s'approprie de différents espaces et le restaurant, c'est seulement un d'entre eux. Mais j'ai bien noté la référence de Bernard Lamizé, qui va certainement être utile pour ma recherche. Merci.
Merci.
Moi, j'avais une petite question pour Aude. Je crois que je n'ai pas votre son, votre micro est coupé.
J'étais juste en train d'écrire une sorte de synthèse extrêmement rapide de votre réponse dans le chat pour nos amis anglophones.
Oh, I'm sorry, ouais. J'aurais essayé de faire en 2 fois.
Okay. C'est bon.
J'avais juste une petite question parce que c'est vrai qu'on parle de la transformation de la mode enfantine qui est souvent réinterprétée à partir des éléments du passé. Il y a cette idée d'héritage qui est un peu le fil conducteur de la conférence. Est-ce que vous avez senti dans vos recherches, dans ces nouvelles versions, dans ces nouvelles interprétations de la mode enfantine, la préoccupation sur la question de genre, parce qu'il y a certaines marques de niche qui vont aller vers le gender neutral, qui vont aussi essayer d'utiliser d'autres couleurs que le rose et le bleu, en allant vers le gris. Parce que je sais que certaines marques ont peur en disant que ce n'est pas profitable, parce que finalement, les parents eux-mêmes suivent, ils alimentent cette idée rose et bleu. Donc, est-ce que vous avez senti qu'il y a une préoccupation dans le cas de Jacadi de cette dimension gender neutral?
Dans le cadre de Jacadi, je ne sais pas, puisque je n'ai pas la connaissance actuelle de la façon dont ils travaillent leur collection.
Vous préférez que je réponde la question en anglais? Pardon.
Ah oui, oui, bien sûr.
Oui.
The question was, are high street children's wear brands focusing particularly in gender neutral collections today? So what's the concept of gender neutral for children's wear, for the children's wear market today? So my answer won't be related especially to Jacadi, as I'm not extremely aware about where they are regarding the gender neutral collections, and I'm not sure that Isabelle Paulet is still online. I think she's left the session because she had other commitments. So Isabelle being the head of communication for ID Kids, and she was part of the audience at the beginning of our session. So what I would like to say here, and this is actually in relation with a lot of projects that my students are currently doing in terms of children's wear, the design for, the design process in children's fashion, is that obviously the education in the global north is looking at similar considerations for boys and girls, and is pushing for a gender neutral education. Yeah. However, the fashion industry, and this is related to the overarching theme of our conference here, the fashion industry is stuck in a design process and retail process where the differentiation between boys and girls has been embedded within the system from the start. For example, when you come into a retail, you're going to have the boys on one side and the girls on the other side, and the babies in the middle. Babies are a bit more gender neutral, actually. If you go into a supermarket, you will have the boys and the girls. And if you look at the management of the brands themselves, you will have a team for boys and a team for girls. So in terms of supply chain, in terms of the the management of the brands themselves and the organization of the production, it's extremely difficult to think gender neutral. because this means that you're going to have to reorganize entirely your product management and the retail and everything. So even though the demand of parents and educators goes towards a more inclusive approach of fashion and towards a more gender neutral approach of fashion, then the fashion industry needs to question the entire system, and this is something that is going to take time, unfortunately. So there's always a gap between what the consumers want and what the fashion industry, especially in the context of children's wear, where the funds are slightly lower than for luxury fashion, for example, things are going much more slowly. But I'm sure that the system is changing, and what's happening in niche brands at the moment will certainly influence the way companies are engaging with their collections and customers.
I can say one thing, if you're interested, Silvano. In my research, in the brands that I studied, just I found the ambiguity gender body just one time. Yeah. So also in the old world of fashion luxury that could be more free and proud of it, it's difficult. Like it's difficult to find a curvy body. It's difficult to find the ambiguity gender, even if it's a strong theme in society.
In your research, Federica, you stopped in 2015, is it?
Yes, from 2010 to 2015.
And I was wondering if maybe the things changed the last 3 years for with two topics. The first one is the Me Too, maybe the Me Too, or the Me Too question, and maybe that changed the way that the pictures will take it, and all the debate about the inclusivity.
Yes, so I didn't, I would like to go on my research and study these years after 2015. But I have to say that just looking at the images in this luxury prêt-à-porter brands, there's still more tradition. So you always find, even I saw the last work of Giorgio Armani, for example, the show. There's still this skeletal body, this androgynous body, but skeletal. That it's very ill. It's not something normal. Okay, for example. So I noticed also in the fashion advertising campaign of this brands that is luxury pret-a-porter, not in street pret-a-porter, because maybe I think that the changes, it's more clear in other brands that are more human, more attached to human being, like the streetwear or so on, also H&M, some simpler and more global, we can say, also brands. The changes are real, but in luxury pret-a-porter, there is still, I think, a bit of afraid of changing things still now. But the multicultural, as I said, the multicultural body and also the curvy body that I found in Cavalli, but with Nicki Minaj, for example. So someone that is accepted curvy because she is famous, not a normal model. So there are changes that maybe are happening, but difficultly in this kind of luxury pret-a-porter, I think.
There's another question here for Federica. Do you think that there is a specific Italian way of representing female stereotypes in the fashion industry?
Difficult. No, so for what concerns the fashion advertising, I don't think so, even if these are Italian brands, but are Italian brands that go through all over the world. The workers, the fashion photographers, the stylists are from all over the world. So Italian, it's a very particular word for what concerns industries, because there are people from all over the world that works together. Okay. What I found is in Dolce & Gabbana. In Dolce & Gabbana, I found something typical Italian, strictly linked to the art history, Italian art history. Botticelli, for example, the spring, or the Italian neorealist cinema with Rossellini or Michelangelo Antonioni or La Dolce Vita, Federico Fellini. So there are some iconographical link, the melodrama by Verdi or Puccini. These links are so strong in these years in the advertising campaigns created by Dolce & Gabbana. There, yes, I can say that there is this Italian style, Italian culture, but in the other one, I don't think there is a stereotypical idea. Yeah, I think it's very global.
Okay. Is there any other question?
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Is there any other question from the audience? The last one that we could take. Don't hesitate to turn on your mic if you want to ask this question.
If there is no more question from the audience, I have one more question to Federica. If I,
Sure.
Yeah. Did you see a difference between the brand's advertisements and the editorial images, or more, for example, between the edgy magazines and the mainstream magazines? There's a difference between them when you talk about the Italian image in the pictures.
So I didn't study the editorials, but I wanted to, as I said in the presentation, I didn't want to create something that is already done, because a lot of researchers nowadays concentrate on editorials. Because fashion advertising is more difficult, because there are a lot of, as I told you, a lot of elements, consumerism, art, and the photographer, okay. So I think that the editorials have their rules. So it's another word, okay? It's something that have to speak to women that take the magazine, just read of them during the journeys or on the train. There's something more, I think, also daily, okay? People that run in, women that do something. If you look at the editorials of those brands, there's something very different. The fashion advertising has to attract your eyes. It has to attract your desire of what you want to be, what you would like to have, or something. So I really don't know, but I think it's different. There are differences, because in fashion advertising there is also more art, more semiotic, more artistic forms than the editorials.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Federica. I think it's time now to wrap up this session. I would like to thank you very much, the audience and the panelists, for your participation and for this very interesting conversation. And I am looking forward to the next panel where Chanel and I think it's Riquiel as well. So the person in charge of the heritage of Chanel and heritage of Riquiel will discuss with Sylvie Marot, who has been attending this session as well. So we will look forward to participate and listen to your very interesting panel, Sylvie. Okay, have a nice afternoon, and thank you very much again.